I was abandoned at birth. Literally. Someone left me on the steps of a hospital with a note. I don't know what the note said, but I've imagined all kinds of things over the years. We can't afford him, we're too young, or maybe just, we don't want him. I'll never know, and honestly I think it's better that way. The hospital passed me off to an orphanage, and that's where I spent the first 12 years of my life. Let me tell you, it wasn't anything like those cozy, heartwarming stories you see in movies. It was harsh. The building itself was this crumbling old place with peeling paint, cold floors, and a smell that was a mix of mildew and boiled cabbage. I'd like to say the people there made it better, but they didn't. The caregivers were indifferent at best, outright cruel at worst. They weren't outright abusive, but they didn't care about us either. Most of them were just there to clock in and out, counting the minutes until their shift ended. A scraped knee? Toughen up. A fever? You're probably faking it. Hugs? Forget it. The kids, though. The kids were the worst part. We were all just broken in different ways, and it showed. Survival of the fittest was the rule of the playground. The older kids picked on the younger ones, and when they weren't around, we turned on each other. It wasn't personal, it was just what we knew. I learned pretty quickly that crying didn't get you sympathy. It got you a target on your back. So I stopped crying. I stopped showing anything, really. I figured if I stayed quiet, maybe I'd disappear into the background. It mostly worked. Mostly. There were a few moments that stand out, though, even after all these years. Like the time I got into a fight over a piece of bread. I was maybe 6, and dinner that night had been particularly bad. A watery stew with some grayish chunks I didn't want to think about. One of the older kids stole the crust of bread I'd been saving, and I snapped. I don't even know what came over me, but I lunged at him. He was bigger and stronger, and I got my ass handed to me, but for the first time I realized I could fight back. I could stand up for myself, even if it didn't always work out in my favor. Still, it wasn't a good life. Every night, I'd lie in my little cot, staring up at the ceiling, and wonder if someone out there was missing me. Did my parents ever think about the baby they left behind? Did they regret it? Or was I just some mistake they were relieved to be rid of? I'll admit, I used to fantasize about them coming back for me. I'd picture this big, dramatic reunion where they'd explain everything and tell me they loved me. But as I got older, I stopped. Hope felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. When I turned 12, everything changed. A social worker showed up one day, looking more put together and professional than anyone I'd ever seen in that place. She told me I was being moved, that they'd found a foster family for me. I remember feeling a mix of excitement and dread. On one hand, it meant leaving the orphanage, which I'd been dreaming about for years. On the other hand, it meant stepping into the unknown. But at that point, anything felt better than staying where I was. Looking back, I think those 12 years shaped me more than I realized. I learned how to keep people at arm's length, how to hide what I was feeling, how to survive. But now, as an adult, I'm realizing those survival skills aren't exactly great for building relationships. My wife doesn't even know the full story. I've told her bits and pieces like how I grew up in foster care, but I've never mentioned the orphanage. I've never told anyone. It's like this secret I've been carrying around, and I don't know if I'll ever be ready to let it go. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it's already catching up to me. When I turned 12, a social worker showed up out of nowhere with what she called good news. I was going to live with a family. Not just a temporary foster placement this time. Adoption. I remember feeling a weird mix of excitement and dread. After 12 years in the orphanage, anything had to be better, right? Spoiler, it wasn't. The Greens picked me up a week later. They were an older couple, probably in their late 40s or early 50s. Mr. Green was stiff and formal, all buttoned-up shirts and a sharp voice. Mrs. Green wasn't much warmer. She smiled a lot, but it never reached her eyes. I should have known right then that something was off, but I wanted so badly for this to work. For them to be the family I'd been waiting for. Their large estate, as the social worker put it, was more of a countryside prison. It was this sprawling old farmhouse with acres of land, way out in the middle of nowhere. At first, I thought it was kind of cool, wide open spaces, fresh air, no kids to bully me, but I quickly realized why they wanted a 12-year-old boy. They didn't need a son. They needed free labor. The first day, they gave me a tour. It wasn't a tour of the house or where I'd be sleeping. It was a rundown of all the chores I'd be responsible for. Feeding the animals, cleaning out the barn, weeding the garden, chopping wood. Stuff I'd never done in my life. I was clumsy and slow, and every mistake earned me a punishment. Sometimes it was extra chores, sometimes it was missing a meal, and sometimes it was just Mr. Green yelling until I felt about 2 inches tall. Mrs. Green was no better. She'd micromanage every little thing I did, watching me with this disappointed look, like I was a dog that couldn't learn a trick. If I folded the laundry wrong or didn't scrub a floor to her liking, she'd sigh dramatically and tell me how lucky I was to be there, that I should be grateful they'd saved me from the orphanage. Grateful. As if this was some kind of charity. They weren't physically abusive, at least not in the traditional sense. But the way they treated me, like I was less than human, left scars I still carry. They didn't care about me as a person. I was just a means to an end, a worker to keep their precious estate running. I tried to do everything right. I kept my head down, did what I was told, and stayed out of their way as much as possible. But no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. One time I forgot to latch the chicken coop properly, and a fox got in. I woke up to feathers everywhere and Mrs. Green screaming at me like I'd committed a war crime. For weeks after that, she called me useless every time I walked into the room. I stopped talking altogether around them. It wasn't worth it. The few times I tried to explain myself or stand up for myself, it just made things worse. So I became invisible. I'd wake up before dawn, do my chores, go to school, which was a whole different kind of nightmare. But that's another story. Come home, do more chores, eat dinner in silence and go to bed. Rinse and repeat. The worst part wasn't even the work or the punishments. It was the isolation. The Greens didn't let me have friends over, and they didn't care about what I did at school as long as I wasn't failing. They didn't ask how my day was or what I was interested in. They didn't care about me, and they didn't pretend to. I used to lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, and wonder what I'd done to deserve this. Had I been a bad baby? Was this karma for something I couldn't even remember? I thought about running away, but where would I go? Back to the orphanage? That wasn't an option. I was stuck. By the time I turned 16, I'd learned to shut down completely. I didn't feel anything. I didn't expect kindness or love or even basic decency. I just existed, doing what I had to do to survive. Looking back, I think that's when I started building the walls I still carry around today. Walls that even my wife can't seem to get through. But the Greens didn't break me, not entirely. They tried, but some small, stubborn part of me refused to let them win. Maybe it was the same part of me that had fought back over that piece of bread in the orphanage. The part that still believed, deep down, that there had to be something better out there. By the time I hit my teenage years, I was practically a ghost in the Greens' house. I went through the motions, waking up, working, and avoiding their constant glares, but inside, I was a million miles away. The only thing that kept me sane was books. I don't even remember how it started. Maybe it was something I picked up at school or something I stumbled on in one of the dusty corners of the Greens' house. All I know is that once I started reading, I couldn't stop. Fiction, non-fiction, classics, obscure titles, it didn't matter. Books became my escape. They let me leave behind the Greens and their endless demands, even if just for a few hours. School wasn't easy, especially when I was younger. I was the weird kid who wore hand-me-down clothes and never talked about his family. I didn't fit in and I didn't try to. But by the time I got to high school, something shifted. I realized I wasn't just good at school. I was great at it. Math, science, literature, I excelled in everything. Not because I was some genius, but because I threw myself into studying with everything I had. It was my way out, and I clung to it like a lifeline. Books taught me about the world I wanted to live in, the person I wanted to be. They showed me possibilities far beyond the Greens' suffocating estate. I started spending hours in the school library after class, poring over textbooks, novels, and anything else I could get my hands on. The librarians got used to seeing me there and would even set aside new arrivals they thought I'd like. Those quiet afternoons, surrounded by books, were some of the only times I felt truly free. When I turned 18, I knew I needed a plan. The Greens had made it clear they wouldn't support me after high school. They saw me as nothing more than a temporary investment, a worker who'd outlived his usefulness. Fine by me. The thought of staying with them any longer made my skin crawl. I started applying for scholarships, pouring every ounce of energy into essays and applications. I didn't just want to leave. I needed to. Then, at 20, the letter came. A full-ride scholarship to a prestigious university, 500 miles away. When I opened the envelope and saw the acceptance letter, I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just stared at it, numb. It didn't feel real. After everything, the orphanage, the Greens, the isolation, this was my chance. My ticket out. The Greens didn't even pretend to care when I told them I was leaving. Mr. Green muttered something about not wasting my shot, while Mrs. Green just sighed like I was inconveniencing her by existing. They didn't even offer me a ride. I packed everything I owned, a few clothes, some old paperbacks, and a notebook, and got on a bus. I didn't look back. The university was everything I dreamed of and more. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who wanted to learn, who wanted to grow. It was intimidating at first. I'd spent so long hiding, keeping my head down, that I didn't know how to be part of a community. But slowly, I started to find my place. Professors noticed me. Classmates invited me to study groups. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I threw myself into my studies, the same way I'd thrown myself into books as a kid. The scholarship covered my tuition, but I still needed money for living expenses, so I picked up a part-time job at the campus library. It felt poetic in a way. Books had saved me before, and now they were helping me build a future. Those years weren't easy. I was balancing classes, work, and the constant fear that somehow it would all fall apart. But for the first time in my life, I had hope. I wasn't just surviving, I was building something. And for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I could have a life worth living. By my second year at the university, things were starting to fall into a routine. I was juggling classes, late-night study sessions, and my part-time job at a cafe just off campus. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay covered my essentials, and I liked the work. The steady hum of the espresso machine, the clatter of cups, and the constant buzz of conversations gave me a sense of normalcy I hadn't felt in years. That's where I met Laura. She was a regular at the cafe, always ordering the same thing. A caramel latte with extra foam. At first, I didn't pay much attention. She was just another customer, albeit one with a warm smile and an air of confidence that stood out. But one evening, she lingered at the counter after placing her order, striking up a conversation. She was a senior majoring in psychology, and somehow we ended up talking about one of my favorite books. I don't even remember how it came up, but by the time her latte was ready, we were deep in discussion. After that, she made it a habit to sit near the counter whenever I was working, chatting with me during lulls in the rush. Laura had this way of making people feel seen, like she actually cared about what you had to say. For someone like me, someone who had spent most of their life feeling invisible, it was intoxicating. Before I knew it, we were spending time together outside of the cafe. She'd help me with my classwork, and I'd listen to her vent about her senior thesis. She was sharp, driven, and had this infectious energy that made me feel like I could do anything. Laura quickly became my rock, especially when things took a turn for the worse. It happened late one night after my shift at the cafe. I was walking back to my apartment when I noticed someone following me. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but when I turned a corner and they turned too, I knew something was wrong. I tried to stay calm, picking up my pace and sticking to well-lit areas, but it wasn't enough. The guy came out of nowhere, grabbing my arm and demanding my wallet. I froze, every survival instinct from my childhood screaming at me to stay quiet, not to provoke him. But when he shoved me against the wall and I felt the cold edge of a knife against my side, something snapped. I fought back. I don't know where the strength came from, but I managed to push him off and run like hell. By the time I got home, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. I didn't have anyone to call. No family, no close friends. So I sat there in the dark, trying to calm down. The next day, Laura noticed something was off immediately. I tried to brush it off, but she wouldn't let it go. Finally, I told her everything. She didn't judge me or act like I was weak for being scared. Instead, she listened, her eyes full of concern, and then said something I'll never forget. "You don't have to carry this alone." From that moment on, Laura became more than just a friend. She was my lifeline. She helped me report the incident to campus security and even walked me home from the cafe a few times until I felt safe again. She made me realize that it was okay to lean on someone, to let them in. I didn't have the words to explain how much that meant to me, but I think she understood. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't just surviving, I was living. And Laura was a big part of that. By the time I was 24, my life felt like it was finally coming together. I'd graduated with honors, thanks in no small part to my relentless focus and Laura's support. After graduation, I landed an internship at Harrison Tech, one of the top technology companies in the country. Felt like a dream come true. Harrison Tech was the kind of place that could make or break a career, and I was determined to make mine. The work was intense, but I thrived on it. I was part of a team developing cutting-edge software solutions, and the challenge of it all was exhilarating. For someone who had spent so much of their life scraping by, the sleek offices, the buzzing energy, and the sense of being part of something big felt almost surreal. I poured myself into the job, working late nights and weekends, eager to prove myself. But as the months went on, I started to notice things that didn't add up. At first, it was small inconsistencies. Files that seemed to go missing and reappear, vague answers from higher-ups when I asked about certain projects. Then there were the whispers among some of the junior employees, hushed conversations that stopped whenever I walked into the room. My gut told me something was off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. One night, while working late, I accidentally accessed a restricted server. I'd been debugging some code when I stumbled upon a folder that wasn't supposed to be there. Curiosity got the better of me and I opened it. What I found made my blood run cold. The files detailed illegal data collection and manipulation practices, things that violated not just company policy but multiple federal laws. Worse, there were records of large sums of money being funneled into offshore accounts and dealings with shady third parties. I sat there staring at the screen, my heart pounding. Part of me wanted to close the folder and pretend I hadn't seen anything, but I couldn't. After everything I'd been through in life, I couldn't ignore something like this. I copied the files to a secure drive and spent the next few days combing through them, piecing together the full extent of what was happening. When I finally had enough evidence, I made the hardest decision of my life. I went public. I didn't have the resources or connections to take on Harrison Tech alone, so I reached out to a journalist known for exposing corporate corruption. The fallout was immediate. The story made national headlines, and Harrison Tech went into damage control mode, denying everything and launching their own internal investigation. I wish I could say that exposing the truth felt good, but it didn't, not entirely. I lost my job the same week the story broke. They didn't fire me outright, probably because they didn't want to seem retaliatory, but they made it clear I wasn't welcome anymore. My key card stopped working, my projects were reassigned, and I was told my internship had concluded ahead of schedule. Laura was furious when I told her. She wanted to fight for me, to demand answers, but I told her it wasn't worth it. I'd known the risks when I decided to blow the whistle. It wasn't about me, it was about doing the right thing. But that didn't make it any easier. I felt like I'd been tossed aside, like all my hard work had meant nothing. Still, there was a small part of me that felt proud. For the first time, I'd stood up against something bigger than myself, and I hadn't backed down. The fallout wasn't over. Harrison Tech had powerful lawyers and PR teams working overtime to spin the narrative. But I knew I'd done the right thing. And deep down, I hoped that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of a new chapter. One where I didn't just survive, I made a difference. After everything I'd been through, the orphanage, the greens, the fallout from Harrison Tech, I never thought I'd get to a place where life felt peaceful. But that's exactly where I found myself with Laura. She had this way of grounding me, of making me believe that no matter how bad things got, we could handle them together. So, when I decided to propose, I knew it had to be something special, something that reflected just how much she meant to me. We'd gone on a vacation to the mountains, a quiet, snow-dusted town with cozy cabins and winding trails. It was the perfect escape from the chaos of everyday life. On our second evening there, I suggested a hike to one of the scenic overlooks. Laura, ever the adventurer, was all in. She didn't suspect a thing, even when I fumbled with my backpack like a nervous wreck the whole way up. The spot I picked was breathtaking. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the valley below stretched out like something out of a postcard. My heart was racing, but I took a deep breath, dropped to one knee, and pulled out the ring I'd been hiding. The look on her face when I asked her to marry me. It's something I'll never forget. She said yes before I even finished my sentence, pulling me to my feet and hugging me so tightly I thought I might pass out. We got married a few months later in a small ceremony with just our closest friends. It wasn't a big, flashy event, but it didn't need to be. The focus was on us, on the life we were building together. I didn't have much family to invite. None really, but Laura's parents were there, along with a handful of mutual friends. It was simple, intimate, and perfect. After the wedding, we started thinking about where we wanted to settle down. Neither of us wanted to stay in the city, so we started looking at properties further out. That's when we stumbled upon the old cabin. It was tucked away in the mountains, a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and in desperate need of repair. The roof leaked, the floors creaked, and the kitchen looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. But something about it felt right. It was the kind of place you could build a life in, a real home. We bought it for $60,000, draining almost every penny we had in savings, and set to work renovating it ourselves. It wasn't easy. Neither of us had any real experience with this kind of thing, but we learned as we went. There were long nights spent scraping off old wallpaper, mornings spent sanding and staining floors, and more trips to the hardware store than I could count. It was exhausting, but it was also incredibly rewarding. Each project we finished felt like a victory, a testament to what we could accomplish together. By the time we were done, the cabin didn't just look like a dream, it felt like one. Every corner of it held a memory. The mismatched tiles in the bathroom we'd argued over, the bookshelves we built from scratch, the little garden we planted out front. It wasn't just a house. It was ours. Sometimes, I'd sit out on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the mist roll through the trees, and wonder how I'd gotten so lucky. After years of chaos and struggle, I finally felt like I'd found my place in the world. A home, a partner, and a future that felt like it was just beginning. When I was 28, I finally decided to take a leap I'd been dreaming about for years. After everything I'd been through, the orphanage, the greens, the whistleblowing at Harrison Tech, I knew I wanted to do something meaningful with my life. I didn't just want to survive or scrape by. I wanted to make a difference. That's when I decided to start my own company. It wasn't an easy decision. I'd always struggled with self-doubt, wondering if I was good enough, smart enough, or capable enough to make it on my own. But Laura, as always, was my biggest supporter. She reminded me that I'd already faced harder challenges than this, and if I believed in my vision, it was worth pursuing. So, with her encouragement, I took the plunge. I called the company Ethitech Solutions, and our mission was simple: to develop ethical technologies that prioritized privacy, transparency, and fairness. I wanted to prove that tech could be a force for good, not just a tool for exploitation. The idea was ambitious, maybe even idealistic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was what I was meant to do. At first, it was just me and a couple of friends from college working out of a tiny, rented office. The space was cramped, the furniture mismatched, and the Wi-Fi barely worked, but we made it work. We spent long days and longer nights, brainstorming, coding, and pitching our ideas to anyone who would listen. Every small success felt monumental: a prototype that worked, a meeting with a potential client, a deal that didn't fall through. Money was tight in those early days. I poured what little savings I had left into the business, and Laura picked up extra shifts at her job to help us get by. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I'd made a mistake, if I was dragging both of us down with this pipe dream. But every time I thought about giving up, I remembered why I'd started. I thought about the people who'd been hurt by companies like Harrison Tech, the people who deserved better. And I kept going. The turning point came about a year in when we landed our first major contract. It was a government grant for a privacy-first educational platform, and it gave us the resources we needed to expand. We hired a few more employees, moved into a slightly bigger office, and started gaining traction in the industry. Word spread about what we were doing, and more clients started reaching out. Nonprofits, small businesses, even a few larger corporations looking to clean up their act. Within a few years, the company was bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue annually. We were still small compared to the tech giants, but our impact was growing. Our products were being used in schools, hospitals, and community organizations, and we were making a real difference. The success felt surreal. I'd spent so much of my life scraping by, living paycheck to paycheck, that the idea of financial stability, let alone success, was almost foreign to me. But what meant more than the money was the sense of purpose. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I was doing work that mattered, and I was doing it on my own terms. Through it all, Laura was my rock. She was there to celebrate every milestone, to pick me up after every setback, and to remind me why I'd started this journey in the first place. We'd sit together on the porch of our cabin, looking out at the mountains, and dream about the future. A future that, for the first time, felt bright and full of possibility. Years after I thought I'd buried my past, it came knocking at my door in the most unexpected and unwelcome way. I was 32, and life was finally in a good place. My company was thriving, Laura and I were solid as ever, and I had started to believe I'd outrun the ghosts of my childhood. Then, one day, an email landed in my inbox that changed everything. The subject line read, "Your parents want to meet you." My heart sank before I even opened it. Inside was a rambling message from a woman claiming to be my biological mother, Karen. She wrote about how she and my father, Thomas, had always wondered what had become of me. They claimed they'd made a mistake all those years ago and wanted to reconnect. But there was a catch. She also mentioned how proud they were of my success and hinted at how helping them financially could mend our relationship. I was stunned. After a lifetime of imagining my biological parents, wondering if they thought about me, if they regretted abandoning me, if they were even alive, this was the reality? Two strangers showing up decades later, not with apologies or explanations, but with their hands out, felt like a cruel joke. First, I didn't respond. I forwarded the email to Laura, and we sat on the couch that night trying to process it. She was furious on my behalf, but I felt mostly numb. A part of me wanted to ignore it entirely, but another part, the part that still carried the scars of being left behind, wanted answers. Against my better judgment, I replied, asking them to explain themselves. Their response was even worse than the first email. Karen launched into a sob story about how hard their lives had been, how they'd been too young and broke to care for me, and how letting me go had been the best decision for everyone. Then, almost casually, she mentioned that they were now in financial trouble and hoped I could help out a little, considering how successful I'd become. The anger I'd been suppressing for decades came roaring to the surface. They hadn't reached out because they cared about me or wanted to make amends. They'd reached out because they saw me as a payday. I ignored their next few emails, but they didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, they escalated. They sent long, guilt-tripping messages about how I owed them for giving me life. They called the company phone line, trying to pressure my assistant into putting them through. Once, they even showed up at our office. When that didn't work, the threats started. They said they'd go to the media with fabricated stories about me being a terrible son, or claim my company wasn't as ethical as it seemed. It was pure blackmail. At that point, I realized ignoring them wasn't an option. I spoke with my lawyer, who advised me to document everything and file for a restraining order. The process was grueling. Just having to sit in a courtroom, facing Karen and Thomas for the first time, brought up feelings I didn't even know I had. They acted as though they were the victims, painting me as ungrateful and heartless for refusing to help them. But the evidence was overwhelming. The emails, the calls, the threats, and the judge didn't hesitate to grant the restraining order. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. Laura was waiting for me outside, her arms open and her face full of the quiet strength I'd come to rely on. "You did the right thing," she said, and for the first time in weeks, I believed her. The restraining order didn't erase the pain they caused, but it gave me the space to move forward. I realized then that family isn't about biology. It's about the people who stand by you, who love you without conditions or ulterior motives. For me, that was Laura and the life we'd built together. Karen and Thomas disappeared after the court case, and I haven't heard from them since. I used to think I wanted answers about why they abandoned me, but now I realize I don't need them. Their actions spoke louder than any explanation ever could. I've learned to stop looking for closure in the wrong places and to focus on the life I've created. A life they have no part in. After the chaos of dealing with Karen and Thomas, life finally began to feel normal again. It wasn't easy to move past everything, but Laura and I leaned on each other, as we always had, and slowly found our way back to the peace we'd built in our little mountain cabin. But just as we started thinking about what the future held, we were hit with another challenge: fertility problems. We'd been trying to start a family for a couple of years, and when nothing happened, we went through the tests and doctor visits that anyone struggling with infertility knows all too well. The results weren't what we'd hoped. Our chances of conceiving naturally were slim, and even with intervention, the odds weren't great. Laura was devastated, and honestly, so was I. But after a lot of long talks and more than a few tears, we realized something important. Biology didn't define family. Adoption had always been something we talked about in passing, but now it felt like the perfect path for us. I had my own complicated history with adoption, sure, but I also knew how life-changing it could be to find a loving home. We started the process with a mix of excitement and nerves, diving headfirst into the paperwork, home visits, and interviews. It wasn't easy, nothing worth having ever is, but every step brought us closer to the life we wanted. And then, one day, it happened. We were matched with a baby girl, a beautiful, bright-eyed little soul we named Jane. The first time I held her, something in me shifted. I looked into her tiny face, and for the first time in my life, I understood what unconditional love really felt like. She was ours, and nothing else mattered. Becoming parents changed everything. Suddenly, the days were filled with baby giggles, midnight feedings, and the endless cycle of diapers and naps. It was exhausting and messy and perfect. Jane became the center of our world, and Laura and I poured all of our energy into raising her in a way that felt entirely different from how either of us had grown up. We wanted her to feel loved, safe, and supported, no matter what. Our cozy mountain cabin, which had once felt like a quiet retreat, came alive with the sounds of family. Jane's laughter echoed through the halls, her toys scattered across the living room like tiny landmines. We spent weekends hiking the nearby trails, teaching her the names of trees and birds. She loved the outdoors as much as we did, her little boots stomping through the mud as she collected rocks and leaves like treasures. At the same time, the business was thriving. Ethitech Solutions continued to grow, and I found a way to balance work with family life. We hired a talented team to handle the day-to-day operations, freeing up more time for me to be with Laura and Jane. I even set up a small home office, complete with a desk that Jane loved to help me work at by scribbling on her coloring books next to my laptop. Life wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was good. Better than I ever imagined it could be. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit out on the porch with Laura, watching the stars while Jane slept inside, and marvel at how far we'd come. From a scared little boy abandoned on the steps of a hospital to a husband, father, and business owner with a life full of love and purpose. We decided early on to be open with Jane about her adoption, just as we were open about everything else. We wanted her to grow up knowing that family is built on love, not blood, and that she was chosen because she was exactly who we wanted. As she got older, she started asking questions, and we answered them honestly. It felt important to me, given my own history, to give her the stability and understanding I'd longed for as a child. Every day with her was a new adventure, a reminder of how much we'd been through to get to this point. Laura and I still had dreams for the future. Projects to tackle, places to see, but more than anything, we were content. We had each other, our business, and our little family in the mountains. It wasn't the life I'd imagined for myself growing up, but it was everything I could have ever wanted. Felt like a new beginning, not just for me, but for all of us. A life built on resilience, love, and the belief that no matter where you come from, you can always find your way home.